Welcome back, everyone. When we left off, we spent a little bit of time trying to understand better this character of Judas and why he did what he did. We tried to understand why he betrayed Jesus, and we left off in the upper room at the Last Supper. Jesus has left to betray Jesus, and in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 26, we have the Last Supper, the meal. Verse 26, it says, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my body of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Verse 29, and I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Verse 30, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. When they had sung a hymn. Think about this. The Passover meal is a structured liturgical event. You have this little book called the Haggadah. It's placed on the table in front of each person around the table. And the Haggadah has all of the readings and all the songs and the sequence of events that everyone is to follow during the Passover meal. There are 4 cups of wine involved in the Passover meal of Jesus' day. The 4th cup is drunk at the very end. There is an empty chair at the end of the table for Elijah, right? Should he choose to appear, right? The door remains open, is left open for Elijah if he chooses to appear, right? The 4th cup is poured, a song is sung, a toast is made saying, next year in Jerusalem. And then the last cup is drunk and the Passover meal ends. But notice this, that they sing the last hymn, but they don't drink the last cup. Now, this would be jarring for a Jew at this time, right? It would be like passing out the communion elements, but before we take them, we just dismiss the church. Say, here you go. But before we take them, we just say, okay, guys, we'll see you next week, right? It just stops before it's over. It's weird. And right, so the hymn is sung. By the way, the hymns that would be sung will be the Passover hymns, right? Psalm 111 through 118. And so the last song would be Psalm 118. And that would be the song that they would sing, right? They sing Psalm 118 and they're supposed to drink the last cup, but instead they get up and leave. Very strange. And there was a witness to the Passover meal. We think his name was Mark. Right? If indeed the room where they're meeting is in the home of Mary, the mother of Mark, then Mark is a young boy. And in the gospel according to Mark, over in chapter 14, Mark chapter 14, when we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, they arrest Jesus and everybody runs and the guards are trying to arrest everyone and they're trying to get their hands on everyone. And we read in Mark chapter 14 in verse 51, it says this. It says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. And when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Right? No other gospel tells us this. It is a specific detail that only Mark includes. Now, why would he include that unless he is the young boy? Now, you would remember making your way home naked in the middle of the night, right? You would know that. You would remember that. And so Mark puts that in his gospel right here. Now remember, Mark's gospel is written predominantly for Gentiles in the church of Rome. Over in chapter 15 of Mark, in verse 21, Mark writes this. He says, a certain man from Cyrene, right, which is Libya today, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, Mark is the only one who mentions these 2 boys' names. Why? Because apparently the people in Rome know who these 2 boys are, right? Simon from Cyrene, right? You know, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who we all know, right? They are part of this community in Rome. And so we think Mark, at the time of the Last Supper, he's probably around 10 years old, right? He was in his nightgown and he's too old to be with the women, but he's too young to be with the men. And so he's probably just sitting on the stairs and he's watching all this take place. And when all of a sudden they get up and they leave before the meal's over, he thought, well, where in the world are they going? And he follows them. And he was at the Garden of Gethsemane. And then when the arrest happens, everybody's running, right? Somebody, right, one of the guards grabs Mark, but he's able to wiggle out of his pajamas and he runs home naked. And he puts that in his gospel. Right? That's a fascinating detail that only Mark would know. And so the Last Supper is ended. It's ended. And they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is arrested. Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin in a private executive session in the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. Right? They question him and they find him guilty of blasphemy. Matthew chapter 26 and at verse 57, it says this. It says, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. And he entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Verse 59, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Verse 62, then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But, verse 63, Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Listen to Jesus' reply. He says, you have said so. But I say to all you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Well, what Jesus has just said, this is a direct allusion back to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 7 and verse 13, where Daniel says this. Daniel says, in my vision at night, I looked and there before me was one like a son of man coming with clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And he was given authority and glory and sovereign power. And all nations and all people of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. And his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. When Jesus said this, when Jesus said, I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, coming on the cloud of heaven. It is a direct allusion to Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, right? And the high priest knows it, and everyone in that room knows it, right? Jesus calls himself the Son of God, right? This is a self-referential title, right? It is all throughout the Gospels, right? No one calls him that except for he himself, right? It is a direct allusion back to Daniel. Right? And it's not lost on the high priest. It's not lost on the Sanhedrin. It's not lost on anyone there. Then, verse 65, the high priest, right, in a rage, he tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? Right? And they're all agreed, right? He is worthy of death, they answered. Right? If he is not that person, that is the absolute highest form of blasphemy that you could speak. And so they condemn Jesus to death. Jesus is then taken out, right? He's slapped around, he's punched in the face, he's beat up. But remember, they need a capital offense under Roman law. And so what they do, they take Jesus to Pilate. And Pilate is annoyed by all of this. Well, over in chapter 27 of Matthew, in verse 11, it says this. It says, Jesus stood before the governor, right? That would be Pilate. And the governor asked him, right? Not a legitimate question, but are you the king of the Jews? No, right? It's almost an absurd question. It's like, you're the king of the Jews? Right? Because Pilate's looking at it, it's like, just look at him, right? This is the one proclaiming to be Messiah just less than a week ago. right? And now here he is, right? He's been turned over by the leaders of his own people, right? He's beaten up, he's bloody, right? He looks to Samuel, it's like, you're the king of the Jews? Right? You're the one that we're supposed to be so worried about? Jesus replied, yes, you have said so, right? Jesus admits to being a king, right? Which under Roman law is treason, right? There is no other king except for Caesar, and he lives in Rome. Now, the Caesar can appoint local kings who work for him, but it's really just an honorary title, right? It really just means you're a governor, or you're a leader of a group, right? And that is it. Well, verse 12, when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Again, Jesus simply stood there and he looked at them in contempt. And then Pilate, verse 13, asked him, don't you hear the testimony that they are bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor, to the great amazement of Pilate. Now, it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. And at that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. And so when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah? For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. Right? Pilate knew, he absolutely knew that there was that this was not a serious charge. Right? Pilate knew these charges were drummed up by the Sanhedrin. They were drummed up by the high priest. They were drummed up by the religious leaders. And so Pilate thought, well, you know what? I'll find a way to end this. I'll release a prisoner. Right? Surely the people who were supporting Jesus just a day before will say, release Jesus and not Barabbas. So think about this. Why do the crowds turn on Jesus? Well, they're expecting a Messiah. They're expecting this liberator, right? They believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and now he's standing there, right? He's condemned by their leaders. He's beaten up. He's standing in front of the Roman government as a prisoner. And so clearly, right, in the crowd's eyes, right, they thought he was a phony, right? And he just sucker punched them all, right? And now they're kind of angry about it. And so they say, no, give us Barabbas. And so Pilate in verse 21 says, which of the two do you want me to release to you today? And they all scream, Barabbas. They answer, Barabbas. Right? What shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Messiah? Pilate asked. And they answered, crucify him. Crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Crucify him. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead, right, in uproar, right, there was this riot that was starting, right, which is what everyone is afraid of, right? No one wants the riot, right? He took water and he washed his hands in front of the crowds. Pilate says, I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. And all the people answer, his blood is on us and on our children. And Pilate turns Jesus over to the Roman soldiers, and they beat him nearly to death. They whip him with a cat o' nine tails, and they crucify him. And Jesus dies very quickly. Right after the beating that he took, right, he's already in hypovolemic shock, and he dies on the cross within a matter of 6 hours. Now, typically, hanging on the cross would take about 3 days for someone to pass. Well, Jesus dies, and he's buried before sundown, right at Passover. And he's put in a borrowed tomb, and when Sunday morning comes, he is gone. Right, when Sunday morning comes, the body is gone, and he is gone. He is resurrected. And how does all of this happen? Well, we'll find out that next week. God bless.